Okay, so moving into where I was about to begin is that appreciation of Gebserian consciousness, I think, is very important. Reading Gebser, except for the academics in the room, it is a challenge. It's really hard to read Gebser. But I think it is worth the effort because in Gebser's own words, that in the end, it's all simple. So I invite those who are new to Gebserian thought to spend more time with Gebser himself. So in this talk, I'm following the path of this conference where the majority of the speakers have either spoken about Gebser and viewed that through the lens of other great thinkers, or in the inverse, where people brought their own beliefs, their own styles, their own experience of integrality, and then related it to where Gebser spoke about. And finally, those talks that talked about new tools to help us appreciate this form of thinking all the more so. But I am going to follow that same path in comparing Gebser and Jung. But I do want to say first that Jean Gebser gave us some incredible thinking, opening up the whole realm of consciousness to many of us, and then giving us a set of tools that allow us to experience integrality as we never have before. Gebser's gifts to us in that regard are unique. They stand alone. There's no need for a co-author or an interpretation through someone else. But I would also say about Carl Jung, whose teachings I have followed for many, many years, that he too offers some unique contributions. His model of consciousness with its ego center, the unconscious, both personal and collective, the notion of individuation, and importantly, the individuation method with its resolution of opposites. So Jung, in my mind, also stands alone and needs no co-author. And yet, I have found that comparing these two thinkers, both their opposites and their common ground, does create reflections that make understanding each of them somewhat more apparent. So starting with connections and disconnections is to look at what is happening in consciousness. So first, we have Jung's differentiation model. So this is one of the, not seeing what I have in front of me. Here we go. Starting with one of the common models of Jungian thought, we have this diagram which shows consciousness on one hand and the unconscious on the other. Within consciousness, we have the ego. Some of these diagrams would make the ego a much larger circle than the one that sits there. These diagrams are difficult. You see persona, the way we project within our consciousness. And on the other side, we have the unconscious, the ultimate model here showing the personal and the collective unconscious. All these are fundamental Jungian concepts. The shadow, archetypes, anima and animus, there can be more put into these circles. But what this shows is the duality of the approach of Jungian thought. Let's contrast that with Gebser intensification. So Gebser question, I don't know if I have a lag time or could be, there it is. Gebser questioned the whole notion of there being, of the usefulness or the, in his mind, the lack of usefulness of organizing things as being conscious on the one hand and unconscious on the other. He thought those terms were misleading and not helpful. So in this model of Gebserian intensification, we have the historic and the new structure of consciousness. So we have the archaic, the magic, the mythic, the rational, and the integral, all shown within the boundaries. That central to Gebserian thought is that consciousness is available to us now, and it is available to us in the present. There is nothing hiding. We just have to know how to access these levels of consciousness. So in the Jungian model, it raises the question of why does differentiation matter at all? We have Jung's words here. Even when the conscious mind does not identify itself with the inclinations of the unconscious, it still has to face them and somehow take account of them in order that they may play their part in the life of the individual, however difficult this may be. This is very central to the Jungian thought. For if the unconscious is not allowed to express itself through worry and suffering, not able to express itself through the word and deed, through worry and suffering, through our consideration of its claims and resistance to them, then the earlier divided state will return with all the incalculable consequences which disregard of the unconscious may entail. So in short, Jung believed that we can't make our issues disappear. They have to be confronted, because if they get laid aside or ignored, they will come back and bite you. The Gebserian model, on the other hand, is looks at the notion of intensity as opposed to differentiation. No structure of consciousness is greater than the other. It's not about moving up or moving down or making bigger or larger. It's about it all being there and the appreciation of it being in intensity. So Gebser says, the aperspective consciousness structure is a consciousness of the whole, an integral consciousness encompassing all time and embracing both man's distant past and his approaching future as a living present. This is the basic synopsis of Gebserian thought. Later on in the EPO, he says, the eruption of time into our consciousness. This is the profound and unique event of our historical moment. It presents us with a new theme and a new task, and its realization, which comes about through us, is attended by a wholly new reality of the world, a new intensity and a freer awareness which supplant the confusion that seems to give our world its most characteristic stamp. And here you see Gebser's attention to the individual. Things come across through us, not through the outer world. So I suggest that there has been movement with both Jung and Gebser towards each other's model. So with a focus on differentiation, it was natural for Jung to treat the conscious, especially the ego, and the unconscious, especially soul and shadow, as contrasting components. But Sanu Shamdasani, the historian who brought us the Red Book, suggests that Jung's later writings in 1937, he revised his thinking about the separation of the conscious and the unconscious and came to understand the concepts as more of a continuum. And Gebser, with very noted reluctance, commented that the unconscious, if one insists on using that misleading term at all, is the structure of consciousness one dimension less than a particular or given structure, and it is the next higher or incremented conscious structure which makes the unconscious amenable to its mode of understanding. So, for example, if one were to focus on, say, the mythic structure of consciousness, here Gebser is saying, well, if you look at the magic and in a period where the mythic is really dominant and we've lost some of the magic, then the magic is sort of like the unconscious, and the rational, which at that time may have not yet become apparent, and that is the latent future, which is sort of like the unconscious as well. And now I'm going to move into a somewhat fanciful part of my presentation, as you will see, of comparing Jungian thought with Gebserian thought, and hopefully in a way that lends some greater understanding of each of them. So in the first part, I look at Jung's spirit of this time that he wrote about in the Red Book, and suggests that it is equal to Gebser's mental structure of consciousness. So in the Red Book, Jung writes, I have learned that in addition to the spirit of this time, this is mental consciousness, there is still another spirit at work, namely that which rules the depths of everything contemporary. The spirit of this time would like to hear of use and value. I also thought this way, and my humanity still thinks this way. But that other spirit forces me nevertheless to speak beyond justification, use, and meaning. And now this is my take on how Jean Gebser might have written this very same passage. I have learned that in addition to the mental consciousness that dominates this time, there are other facets of consciousness at work, namely that which rules the integral and by its nature includes everything contemporary. The spirit of this mental, scientific, rational time would like to hear of nothing but use and value. I also thought this way, and my humanity still thinks this way, but that other spirit forces me nevertheless to speak beyond justification, use, and meaning. And now a little more from the Red Book, looking at the power of Jung's spirit of the depth being equivalent to the intensity native to Gebser's structures of consciousness. So again, from the Red Book, And I should say that the Red Book represents Jung's earliest thinking and didn't become available to us till after his death, but that he spent the rest of his life and wrote what is now the collective works, which take up at least that much space, playing out what he learned in his days when he wrote the Red Book. So here Jung says, I long sought to hold that other spirit away from me, but I did not consider that spirit of the depth from time immemorial, and for all the future possesses a greater power than the spirit of this time. The spirit of the depths has subjected all pride and arrogance to the power of judgment. He took away my belief in science. He robbed me of the joy of explaining and ordering things, and he let devotion to the ideals of this time die out in me. And now, how Jean Gebser might have written this paragraph. I long sought to hold that less easily accessible spirit away from me, but I did not consider that spirit co-present from time immemorial. So this is the co-presence of the Gebserian models of consciousness from time immemorial and for all the future, but nearly lost to us in the domination of mental consciousness, possesses a power as intense as the spirit of this time, mental time, who changes with the generations. The spirit of the depths has subjugated all pride and arrogance to the power of judgment. He took away my belief in science. He robbed me of the joy of explaining and ordering things, and he let devotion to the ideals of this mental dominated time die out in me. Next, I want to turn to a selection from Mysterian Conjunctionis. So now we go to the other end of the collected works. Jung wrote 3 long volumes based on his 30 years of looking at alchemy. And Mysterian Conjunctionis is the very last of those works. So we go from the early phase to the late phase, and to look at Jung's consciousness widening, the notion that consciousness gets bigger. So in the Jungian model, Jung's goal was to open up the unconscious and bring it into consciousness. That was the of making consciousness bigger, if you will. And here we compare that with Gebser's consciousness intensification. Of it's all there. You have to be able to conceive, to appreciate the structures of consciousness in order to reach integrality. So here's Jung's passage from Mysterium. The concept of human wholeness has primarily a therapeutic significance in that it attempts to portray the psychic state which results from bringing over a dissociation between conscious and unconscious. Above all, consciousness experiences a widening of its horizon. This certainly brings about a considerable improvement of the whole psychic situation, since the disturbance of consciousness by the counteraction of the unconscious is eliminated. And now looking at how Jean Gebser, a philosopher as opposed to Jung's psychologist, might have written this passage. The concept of co-presence of human wholeness has primarily an atemporal significance in that it attempts to portray the psychic state which results from the unfolding of consciousness. Above all, everything depends on an intensification of consciousness. This certainly brings about a considerable improvement of the whole psychic situation, since the disturbance of consciousness by the domination of mental consciousness is eliminated. So here we're seeing both the contrast and the commonality. With Jung, we need a resolution of opposites, of a bringing together. We need a complex that needs to be resolved. It's one approach to moving towards wholeness, towards self, towards integrality. And Gebser's approach, on the other hand, is to say there's another window into that process, and that process can be viewed as a purely internal one in which things are available to you, complex or not. So now I want to look at conflict resolution in Mysterium and look at Jung's individuation method versus Gebser's integral atemporality. So here's Jung's, So here's Jung's passage. But because all good things must be paid for dearly, the previously unconscious conflict is brought to the surface instead and imposes on consciousness a heavy responsibility, as it is now expected to resolve the conflict. Like the medieval alchemists, the modern man needs a special method for investigating and giving shape to the unconscious contents in order to get consciousness out of its fix. As I have shown elsewhere, an experience of the self may be expected as a result of these psychotherapeutic endeavors, and quite often these experiences are numinous. Now, a potential take by Jean Gebser on this passage. But because all good things must be paid for dearly, and they both believe that, the previously unidentified conflict is brought to the surface and imposes on the ego the often painful task of ego transcendence. That is the decisive task of human life. Those are actually Gebser's words from another source. They both saw the need for the individual to work through things and found that experience is going to be pretty tough. Like the medieval alchemists, the modern man needs a special method for investigating and giving shape to a temporal consciousness in order to arrive at integrality. And I suggest that Gebser gave us a whole bunch of tools as part of his method. As I have shown elsewhere, an experience of the self may be expected as a result of time-free experience of integral consciousness, and quite often, these experiences are numinous. Next, I want to look at a passage from the ever-present origin. And here it starts with, it is neither a tertiary or a third component that unifies opposites. This is Gebser. Nor a secondary or polar complement, nor a primary, unitary, and self-contained state from which it can emerge. So he rejects that the source of this is any single structure of consciousness. It is the originary presence that has itself attained consciousness because one of its bearers, man, has undergone the spatio-temporally conditioned unfolding of consciousness, which he has enjoyed but has also had to suffer through. Only someone who has integrated the past as well as the future, with their inevitable psychic emphasis on joy and suffering, and free themselves from the tensions and prepossessions of the once unconscious psychic structure, is able to realize the present. So now reversing text, this is a same passage as if written by Jung. It is neither a tertiary or third component that unifies opposites, nor a secondary or polar complement, nor a primary, unitary, and self-contained state from which it can emerge. There is no magic bullet. It is the resolution of opposites, Jung would say, that allows consciousness to increase as the psyche, the soul and spirit, undergoes a spatially, temporally conditioned unfolding of the unconscious, which each traveler has enjoyed but has had to suffer through. Two different paths. But only someone who has integrated the past as well as the future with their inevitable psychic emphasis on joy and suffering, and free themselves from the tensions and prepossessions of the once conscious psychic structure, is able to realize the present. And now a few words about the Jung and Gebser views on past, present, future, and latency. So during an interview with Anil Yaffe, who was co-author with Jung of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, conducted an interview on October 3rd, 1957, where Jung commented on his Liber Novus vision. So Liber Novus is the first book of the Red Book, first section. Jung began his comments that day by stating his vision had taken him in mind or spirit a few hundred years into the future. He added, "That is why I am considered wise." Jung recounted that he engaged in his visions. He had figuratively fallen into an immense hole. His merits was, he supposed, that he had not been lost in it, that he is able to still keep some perspective. And Jean Gebser in 1953 in The Ever-Present Origin writes, "What is to come? At first glance, it may seem this is only a question about the future. But in fact, it is primarily one about our present situation. The events of tomorrow are always latently present today. Tomorrow is nothing other than a today which is not yet acute. It is still latent. Every manifestation of our lives inevitably contains the sum of what is past as well as what is to come." Now, maybe a good moment to mention that as we're looking at the present, it is hard to disregard the times that we are in, and they are, at the very least, difficult times. But it's also a good time to point out that as much as we can learn from Gebser and Jung, towards the end of each of their lives, they predicted that either we would reach a level we have not yet in the decade or two after their passing, or that the world would essentially come to an end. So predicting about time and evaluating just how deeply we are in trouble and where we will go from this goes even beyond the greatness of these thinkers. So I want to look at a Jungian statement about past, present, and future that approaches, in this case, Gebser's concept of time freedom. The collective unconscious is not only a receptaculum of the past, but also a living organism containing the future development as well as the past. The historical past cast its shadows into our souls, and even greater shadows, in fact. The shadow of the future allows us to learn even more and greater things about somebody than the shadow of the past. Psychologically speaking, we move away from the past into the future. The former is alive and reproducible in us in the form of memory. Given the power of history and man, it is even more astonishing that the future, that is what does not yet exist, is also powerful. In the unconscious, however, it seems as if these things already somehow existed, like a seed that is difficult to decipher. But in reality, these things are not seed-like at all, but are present in their full force, although we cannot explain them. Jung did not yet have the language to bring this concept of the present, of the ever-present, into being, and this is how he approached that. Now, here's how Gebser might have rewritten Jung's statement. The collective unconscious is not a receptaculum of the past, but rather is a living organism in human consciousness, containing the future development as well as the past. The historical past cast its shadow into our souls, and either greater shadows, in fact. The shadow of the future allows us to learn a broader spectrum of things about somebody than the shadow of the past alone. Psychologically speaking, the past and the future are both latently present. So since Gebser was a philosopher, that sentence could have read, philosophically speaking, the past and the future are both latently present. The former is alive and reproducible for us in the form of memory. Given the power of history and man, it is even more astonishing that the future, that is what does not yet exist, is also powerful. In integral consciousness, however, these things already somehow exist, like a seed that is difficult to decipher. But in reality, these things are not seed-like at all, but are present in their full force and can be experienced, although we cannot explain them. And I might emphasize here that Gebser is a different type of philosopher. Most philosophers you read, you imbue their thinking and their thoughts. Most of it requires no one except yourself in a book. Gebser is a living philosophy. If it's not experienced, it means very little. And those words are like difficult to bring to meaning other than to say that I encourage people who are interested in continuing to explore Gebserian thought, find somebody else to share it with, because that opens up the sharing experience and the growth experience. So I want to share a quote from Algis Mickiness. Algis is one of the two translators of the Ever-Present Origin, which was brought to us only in English in 1985. And Algis today is one of my teachers. And I discovered in his endless number of works this particular quote, which I think kind of frames the notion of transparency and integrality. So Algis writes, the integral time awareness is not a blowing together of all events into one and squeezing them till they yield eternity, but the co-presence of temporal articulation of past, present, and future, such that neither one means anything without the others, and that they do not point to their unity, but to their co-present difference, and thus their mutual visibility one through the other. I think that's kind of the touchstone of what Gebser is trying to teach us. So to finish up this presentation, I want to speak a bit, or let Jung and Gebser speak a little bit about self-knowledge and working on ourselves. So Jung in Mysterium writes, with the advance towards the psychological, a great change sets in. For self-knowledge has certain ethical consequences, which are not just impassively recognized, but demand to be carried out in practice. The self, in its effort at self-realization, reaches out beyond the ego personality on all sides. Because of its all-encompassing nature, it is brighter and darker than the ego. And Gebser's passage from EPO is, all work, the genuine work which we must achieve, is that which is most difficult and painful, the work on ourselves. If we do not freely take upon ourselves this pre-acceptance of the pain and torment, they will be visited upon us in an otherwise necessary individual and universal collapse. Jung too could have used those words. So I leave you today with some thought about how these two great minds shared a great deal of common ground that helps us understand each of them. Thank you.